So far, from the conversations that we had here, I understand that the people who usually like to talk about decentralized AI and open source are the most optimistic ones, apparently. So I want to know if that's true from your side or not.
Let's see. Hi.
Hi. Just one question, Bart. Can you see us as well?
Yes, I can see you. I hope you can hear me. I lost a bit my voice, but
All right.
can you hear me?
Cool. We can hear you.
Yeah, we hear you well.
So, welcome. Let's talk about decentralized AI and open sourcing it. My name is Toby. I'm running the Keats Accelerator. We do help startups, deep tech startups focused on AI, sourcing them from university, but also outer university research institutes, and helping them to grow. Let's first introduce yourself. So, Beatrice, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Beatrice Arts. I'm the founder of Kiona Health, which is a femtech company trying to get hormonal health AI-ized to... in the end, just trying to get medical data into our digital age, which has not been the case, especially for female health. In the same time, I'm a so coming from medical IT as well as engineering background. So basically, I was a programmer until I started working at Microsoft, where I became a seller, and then quickly realized that I wanted to go back to academia and really coding and having fun with machine learning.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm Thomas Haferlach. I founded Pollinations.ai. It's basically a company and an open source initiative. My background is I studied AI AI and computer science in 2001 in Scotland, which is quite a while ago. I've been like working in the kind of, I worked at like the kind of Amazon and Sun Microsystems, some big tech companies, but then I got more into kind of art and culture. And in the last, but always, let's say, working with multimedia, working with digital things. And in the last 5 years, since kind of generative AI has been getting so kind of exciting and so many possibilities, I've been fully focused on like experimenting with all kinds of multimodal generative AI models, working a lot in the music domain too, in different startups. But yeah, Pollinations.ai is my project, but I'm sure we'll talk about it more.
Cool, thanks. Bart, do you want to continue?
Yes. I will try to keep it short because my voice is not up to date yet. So my name is Bart de Witte. I spent 20 years of my life in big tech and working for SAP and IBM, always focusing on healthcare. I was working with machine learning projects since 2010. I was also in that whole Watson Health hype from IBM involved. And in 2019 or 18, I started to question if we can or should not build on a different narrative when we talk about AI and healthcare, because the biggest fear that I have is that we privatize all medical knowledge and concentrate that in 2 companies in West Coast, California, which is a scenario that can happen. So I've started advocating for open source, have built my foundation, and now building in stealth mode open source based AI assistants for physicians. But so I'm building on the foundational side, non-profit, and as well on the profit side based on the principles that I stand for. I hope you can hear me because my voice is terrible.
We can hear you perfectly. Super interesting. So maybe let's start this discussion with a little bit provocantly. OpenAI started as an open source company, but went closed. Facebook, Meta is, I think, like one of the closest companies, but went open source earlier this year. Mark Zuckerberg even compared it to Linux, when I remember correctly. So, what do you think might be, like, for both directions? First of all, the reasoning. Why are companies opening up, or why are companies closing again?
Want to start?
I mean, as we have heard, I think for the past 2 days, I wasn't here yesterday, but I guess it's the same thing. We're always talking about money and power, and that is the main reason we're closing, or then also strategically opening up and reopening up source code or data or other things, models. And I think one of the biggest problems in there is that we're driven by the, yes, somehow the community, which is then the mainstream media for opening up again. I guess this is one of the biggest, this is also why I think Linux is such a bad example. Yeah, but in general, this is just my take on it, and throwing this out as, I think, one of the statements that is already obvious.
Yeah, I mean, I see kind of the open source movement in the creative AI field. I find it very inspiring, like, because we have a community, pollinations, and there's people from all kind of walks of life experimenting with AI models. There's a 13-year-old prompt engineer in our community. There's people who are kind of hacking these models to do games, to do educational apps, and so on. And I feel like the open source side, of course, the motivation for these big companies to invest in open source is definitely like profit driven. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is necessarily thinking about the good of the world, right? But I think the side effects can be good, and that's something that kind of gives me hope in this kind of like world where with hypercapitalization, where the companies are growing, more and more powerful, making more and more money. The open source side feels like a little bit of a counterbalance to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bart, yeah.
Yes, Meta is definitely not doing this in terms of a power play or marketing washing. This is pure economics. The core business model of Meta is selling advertisements. Meta spends 2.6 billion a year in content moderation. Their goal is to use LLMs for automating the content moderation part. 2.6 billion is a lot of money. Now you have two options. You can use an API of OpenAI as Meta and becoming extremely dependent on a single provider, or you can spend 1 billion of your 2.6 billion in just releasing that open source and giving that to the community and tapping into the wisdom of the crowds and the wisdom what open source communities always do. They accelerate innovation, they're way cheaper, they reduce the R&D cost, and that's actually what Meta did. In return on the OpenAI side, and Anthropic is another one, their core business model is similar to Google search. It is capturing, it is extracting, it is not releasing, editing, and it leads to, at the end, to a monopolization or a centralization of power and knowledge. I think these two are totally opposed. And then as a small remark, we have to be careful with Meta. Meta, according to the open source definition, isn't completely open source, because according to the official definition that we defined, is that open source as well need transparency on the data being used, which is something that Meta doesn't do. And secondly, the license that Meta uses is limited, is restricted, is owned by Meta, but there are 10,000 other models out there, and we have seen Mistral AI rising as a unicorn in Europe using the open source philosophy, and in 1 year time, having models that are on par with OpenAI, and has become the leading AI company in Europe based on their open source strategy.
So, if I understood correctly, so open sourcing has a commercial side and I would say a crowd intelligence side or a building side. Yeah. So the commercial side, it helps you. Like I see it also from some of our startups. It helps you to, as a startup, for example, if you not sure about your market, you're not sure about your customers, putting your solution on GitHub might help you to find the ideal customer, for example. But it helps you also to get feedback from your users and to innovate and to build basically on your product. So in case of Meta, is that good or bad now? What do you think?
You mean, are they in generally now? Would I view them favorably because of their or specifically to their open source?
Because I feel like they do it for like as we also heard, like for those two reasoning, right? So first of all, they want to spread. Yeah, they want to save resources. Yeah, that's a commercial part. Do marketing, but also compete. They want to innovate their llama, right? To make it better. So is it good or bad?
I mean, I would say it's one of the rare cases, maybe where, and maybe. Okay, some people have a more profound, like, let's say, opinion on this, but one of the rare cases where both the interests of the company and the interests potentially of the greater community, at least at this point, maybe align. Because what we get as open source developers, we get very powerful models to play with, and Meta gets some kind of benefit. The community adopts their models, the community builds tooling around the models. So at the moment, I don't see it so cynical, even though the motivations, you know, I may question, you know. But yeah, I'd like to see what the others think about that.
I think it's a really interesting case because here we have something so powerful that has been thrown out there and is doing kind of exactly the opposite of what we have been seeing in the past few years. So I like those kind of, or seeing those kind of experiments and also thought experiments playing out, because there is also a big part of unpredictability in there, because we don't know what players are going to use it, what the communities are, what they're doing it from it, then also how political situations, how societal situations are developing in the next few months and years. So for me, this is actually, I think, one of the most exciting things I have read this year or in the past year since ChatGPT came out, for me personally. So I have to say I'm positive, because I just think we need some steering up and some change and some more different opportunities on different sides of who can actually be part of this big movement, and not just one big player or the big players, but actually having the chance of also helping in this development, or taking this also to our own advantage and using it for our own community-driven projects, and also thought experiments where we can actually take our own problems into solutions and using this powerful technology.
Yeah, so I'm not here to judge Meta. I find these binary questions, good or bad, always difficult. I think when we look at what you need to question is that the contribution to the open source network, is it a good thing? Of course, that's a good thing. Without Meta, we would not have seen that revolution in the open source AI world. The publication that they did of Llama 1 and 2, which is already nearly 2 years ago, led to an incredible amount of innovation. It led to people even making these models so small I can run them on the phone, when we talk later about decentralized AI, completely detached from the big tech infrastructure. So it is very good that companies contribute to the open source system. That's what IBM did with Linux and Apache Foundation 30 years ago. I think people don't realize how software was 40 years ago. Software 40 years ago was a proprietary thing. And Bill Gates wanted to close software code and copyright software code, which never, there was a huge battle in that time as well. And the reason why we all can learn how to code is because we have access to libraries, we can learn from each other, and it's the most democratized asset in the digital world, is software code. And we heard at the time as well, it's going to be dangerous, people are going to write false code, and there were all these negative stories being told. Well, the net positive of open source software is amazing. It led to all these companies being able to tap into the digital, or the opportunity that the digital world gives us. So I think the net positive is always good when people contribute. I also think that we need to be very careful. Open source is not an application. Open source LLMs is a tool, it's code. It should not be judged as an application, because somebody needs to apply it, put it to use. And then we need to look at who's responsible and and what kind of design you use and what kind of ethics are embedded within. But it's kind of sharing the alphabet that allows us to write books. So it's kind of a building blocks to innovate.
Microsoft is a very good example in this case, because I think that when it started to be usable with the version 10, it was completely rebuilt based on Linux, I would say, even, right? If I remember correctly, that's where it started to be usable.
Yes, but it's open source always wins.
Yes.
That's the thing. There is nobody who can compete against open source collaboratives. There is no way. That's why you see a lot of resistance. And I think open source gives us the biggest opportunity to not allow two companies to own all the power that AI gives us. It allows us to democratize the technology.
Interestingly, I mean, like, because OpenAI has been lobbying now, like, for kind of regulation, right? And like, if you look at kind of like their motivations behind that, you would question whether they want to be like one of the few companies who are allowed to kind of do this research, and that they're kind of lobbying for regulation could be in part like motivated by kind of this kind of like, we want to be the select few companies who are allowed to work with these very large models. Now, I don't know if there's like a part of kind of concern for society. Of course, that's also part of the, but you have to always look what is the goal, you know? And I think like with these regulation discussions, I'm often a little bit cynical if the companies are really, you know, if they really want to regulate for the benefit of society or for their own benefit.
And I think there comes actually in the topic that is the most complicated around open source, which is also regulations, talking about policies, who's responsible, who is or who has to put these regulations into place, and who can also use them for their benefit. How far do we go there? Do we actually restrict the good people with that and make more space for the bad people that know how to navigate and get around those regulations? And this is what always concerns me with open source a lot more, because the big closed source companies are in the spotlight. And open source often is not. If we talk about Linux, I think that's a good example. If I would talk to my mom about Linux, she still wouldn't know what it is. Even it has been around and has been so important for all of our technology and advance. But if I talk to them about OpenAI or ChatGPT, they right away know. So this has been in the spotlight. And I think this is something that we just have to look out for. I am 100% positive on open source. I just think that we have to think a lot more complexly about open source advances, because actually there are more people involved. There is just so much more dots that we have to connect and think of. And that's just one thing that I wanted to add to exactly that regulation topic. And I think I already took kind of your questions.
I
maybe-
wanna comment on
maybe-
the
yes.
regulations. I've been intensively engaged by saving open source within the regulatory discussions. I've been in Brussels, I've been in New York during the United Nations, and it's ridiculous what kind of dogmas are being spread around open source. What you need to know, it's not OpenAI who was the really bad actor in the open source. It was the guys between Anthropic AI. One of the key investors of Anthropic was Dustin Moskovitz and Jan Tallinn, which by chance are also the founders of the Future of Life Institute, which has received 650 million in lobbying on AI safety. They were publishing, I call it bogus science papers, that open source would create bioterrorism and enable the bad actors. All these papers have been debunked. Like scientists said, like if you use Google search, you get better results than using an LLM in order to recreate a virus or anything else, because these LLMs do nothing else as augmenting or retrieving information that was already out there. So if these models are giving access to knowledge or information, that knowledge was already accessible in the first place. So there is a huge battle here in the back end on the regulatory space, where people are creating fear that this would be lead to whatever, kill the democracy, lead to bioterrorism. I think if somebody would try to create with open source a virus that would kill everyone, I think the virus would first kill these people in the lab, because putting data into a virus and then making that synthetic a part of our real world is an extremely difficult process. And we have checks and balances there. If you want to buy these machines, these will be registered. There is a lot of control in that area, not on the information layer. So we really have to watch out that we don't fall in that trap that we start regulating R&D. Because if you start regulating R&D, we will kill the open ecosystem. So to give an example, one of the amendments in the OpenAI Act was that researchers that would publish their LLMs on GitHub or Hugging Face would have been made liable for later dual use of these models. That would mean if somebody would create an app and then do something really bad, you as a researcher would have been made liable because you published that. Now, that leads to nobody publishing anymore. And that was actually the intent. People wanted that to happen, that nobody would publish, because all universities would say, you should not publish because we have high risk and high liabilities, so nobody will publish anymore. And then you kill the open source ecosystem, which was the intent of the lobbyist of the closed world. So if this world is complex, I agree with that. But the world of lobbying is very complex and intransparent, and we're talking about trillion-dollar industries in the future. So there is a lot of power distribution here happening through the regulatory discussions.
I just want to...
Interesting thought. But before we jump, like I see like the regulation topics. But before we jump into that topic, because I left it like basically for the last part of the discussion, I would like to know, like it was like because you are all builders, right? So how do you use first open source? How do you integrate open source in your specific products, in your specific in your innovation, in your R&D? But before that, I would also like to ask the audience, before we like dive like too deep into the tech part, like who of you is building? Just to have an idea, who of you is not building? Who of you is regulating? There we. Okay. Would you like to start?
Oh yeah. I mean, like everything. I've been coding. Since like I don't know, since the mid '90s, and it used to be now when you're building any kind of project, whether be it closed sourced or open source. Probably the majority of like tools you are using are open source tools if you're working kind of in the like on the development side, right? I think the big kind of frameworks, closed source frameworks, have lost out exactly against these forces of community and I mean, it's difficult to say. Maybe I'm still personally quite often using closed source AI models because they're just easy to use. You know, I'm using ChatGPT a lot, although I have started using more and more open source language models because they're just getting also very powerful. But yeah, I find it maybe difficult to answer because I use open source basically in everything I do, and I'm also kind of contributing. So yeah, even to maybe cook food, I'm using some open source recipe app. So yeah.
For me, it has been an up and down. And I purposely said that I was a seller at Microsoft because that was before OpenAI, and I mean, also after would have been the same, I guess. But I kind of went into that job thinking as a data engineer, data scientist, I would be doing AI on really also a development basis. But most of what they have is the closed source solutions, and they have packaged solutions for people that want to use AI and have no idea what machine learning is. So in the end, what I did at that point was, before that I was in academia and we used open source on a daily basis. Then I was at Microsoft and it was really just some black boxes that I tried to use, get some input, some output in and showcase that. And now with the founding of my own company, I have yet encountered a new problem, which is the lack of data of marginalized groups, which in this case is women. And so I would like to, I mean, open source tooling, sure. But there is a lack of data sets, there is a lack of research on that, and then for sure also AI models to actually use the missing data sets and missing really data that is around that topic, especially then also now in health, where we know that the digitalization hasn't been as advanced as we needed to. So for me, it's been an up and down. And right now, I have to say I'm struggling. And this is also why this year, actually, I started my PhD for health or female health in AI and female health this way. And one of the reasons, or the biggest reason for me, was actually to change this situation and to get more of open source or published information, models, etc., out there to be used and to get the innovation ahead. So I'm trying to get back into my open source game.
I think it's interesting because you said data, right? Because when we talk about open source, we're often talking about code. And with AI models, the data becomes very important. And yeah, and then we have to also see, like, because a lot of the companies who claim they are open source, they are releasing the recipe how to train the model, but these AI models, they are only as good as their data. So in the end, the data becomes certainly with AI becomes a very important factor in this kind of question. Like, and then also very difficult questions, right? What happens if you train an AI model on copyrighted data? Yeah, I guess it's one of the key questions, right? Especially in the kind of creative field. But yeah, I didn't want to go too far away because I found also the kind of your point with the marginalized groups and little data being available very interesting. But yeah, I just wanted to say there's a kind of a new question arriving. How do we treat big data sets?
You're going directly, like exactly into this direction. I wanted to lead this discussion into data. Yes, I think yesterday was Jonas from Aleph Alpha. There was I don't know how to call it in English, the Digitalgipfel. So that's basically a meeting where all the politicians talk about digital stuff with industry leaders. And he basically mentioned that the largest positions on Aleph Alpha's R&D costs is basically the data sets. What would be... do you use open source? Are there open source data sets? I think health is difficult, probably.
I mean, Kaggle is still my go-to research database place. So I do still use Kaggle. I started when I was still a student and wanted to do cool shit. And then I graduated and I started realizing that there's actually really cool stuff on there that you can work with. And those are the data sets sometimes that we're still using for creating some kind of easy machine learning algorithms, but not in that sense. But there's also a lot of open source data sets, not a lot, but big data, open source data sets in health, actually for medical imaging data that is usable. So if anyone is interested or using that or in need, for sure, come to me and we talk about it. I've been using those for the past years, and it's super interesting to see that there's actually in the past, I think 2 years, or since COVID, a lot of it coming out open source and a lot of also EU or national funding coming out to create large data sets in different topics that are going to be open sourced.
Bart? Yeah.
Yes. I use open source as well. Just for that last question, since I use open source, I have models that I run on my phone in flight modus. So it feels a bit like, I don't know if you saw that movie Men in Black with the cat having the arc-creating galaxy on the necklace, where the whole universe was compressed in a little sphere. That's how it feels. I have a 1 gigabyte file on my phone, being completely offline and having access to all the information. It's extremely liberating because I'm not being surveilled. That's how I'm starting to build my new startup, because we are building as much models on the phone, which are recognizing voices, speech recognition, and process this on device, not in the cloud. So we can do a lot of these things, and I hope that the German Miele and other suppliers will use LLMs with speech recognition so I can finally talk to a washing machine. But that's a joke. But in terms of open data sets, there are many people working on larger data sets. We have the first big data set was the Pile, which was a really big data set for training open source LLMs. And there are interesting developments, like, for example, France recognized that if they don't publish French open data sets with French language, then in that digital sphere, their culture might disappear. So the French Ministry of Culture is financing the creation of a lot of training data sets. I'm doing the same with the Belgian government. I'm a Flemish. So our Flemish culture is a minority culture. And I think by publishing these data sets, we can make our Flemish culture part of that training data set and not disappear it. For example, I do that with my son. I have a 4-year-old son. I create bedtime stories with him. And I fine-tune an open source model based on Flemish literature in order that these bedtime stories are connected to my original culture. And you can think of all these ways. Open source gives the possibility of local communities to use their local data sets that they don't have to share, but can fine-tune and then embed it within their local cultural norms and context. And I've been supporting many African developers that are doing independently from big tech. They don't need a credit card anymore in order to get access to an API. They can just run these models on their laptop and start building, and it's beautiful. But we need way more data. We need way more funding. The governments need to invest in the creation of what we call not open data, but data commons. And another example data set is a friend of mine created a data set with all the YouTube videos that are licensed under the Creative Commons open source license. There are many things happening in that field, just not enough. We need more data, and we need to get rid of that idiotic idea that data will stay like something worthwhile that we need to monetize. I think the only way to fight the asymmetries is to liberate access to that data set.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I was in Morocco the last 2 years for this Essaouira festival. And meeting some Gnawa musicians. It's a kind of a local Moroccan music style, and I got to talking to the. We were testing different AI models to see how well they can do Gnawa music, and they have no idea of Gnawa music. So I even made a project. I was sending it to some institutes, but the idea is to kind of capture. He works also at an institution for the preservation of Gnawa music, and they were very interested in kind of capturing this data so that an AI can understand their music. So they are not like their part of the culture is not excluded from the AI models, because you get with the kind of language models also that are kind of trained by the big companies, you get a very normative kind of tone, this kind of like subservient, helpful assistant, and it's kind of reflecting a very specific culture, right? And there we need this. I'm drifting away from the data part, but what I want to say is, we need to have this possibility to kind of collect this data and not just the data that represents the views of a board members in Silicon Valley.
I would like to add one thing that we have come up at the creation of my femtech company, Kaona Health. That was actually the part of data donations that we thought would be interesting to give then with the consent of the user, their anonymized data to a research institute, which is a nice idea, we thought. But what about if we actually get the consent to publish this and make a data set, an open source data set out of this, of really the collected data of all the users with consent about their health data that is completely anonymized and also within of GDPR, checked by all the states of it. And it was so interesting because and I think this is also the monetization part. As soon as the user realizes how valuable their data is, they're also ready, especially for the advance of their own purposes, give this data out for free as a donation. And this is something that maybe is also interesting in your cases where you're working in, that those kind of data donations or consentful data usage as open source, as made open source, is something that I actually see how everyone can contribute to this movement of open sourcing and taking a little bit away the power of the closed source data sets that we have in the world.
Cool. So since we touched now, I think the whole spectrum on open sourcing AI, so we had like the algorithms and the data sets, we can jump into regulation right now. Because like at the Digital Gipfel, that wasn't the only thing that Jonas gives a little bit a sneak peek in his R&D cost, but there was also announced a like my point of view, interesting initiative, which is called the Data Hub, where basically something like very special happened there, because the largest commerce company in Europe, Schwarz Group, together with the largest, I think it's the largest AI employer. So for AI stuff, it's the Deutsche Bahn. People mostly don't know. I think they employ a lot of, like at the AI factory, a lot of AI developers. Together with Aleph Alpha, they want to create a kind of data trust. I would define it. So giving companies the option to give their data into a trust structure and let the trust structure manage basically the licensing for the data. So everyone can basically build on top of that AI solutions. Yeah. What do you think? Does have a future?
I maybe I'm not the best. I don't have the most profound opinion on this question. Yeah, maybe.
I can comment. Like the data trust is a part of the Digital Governance Act of the European Union. So you have data trust for data altruism. You have other ways to do that, and data trust are nothing new. Like in the biomedical space, we have data trust for genetic data in the UK. The biobanks are data trust. The problem with this is if we start mixing now data trust with open source data, that is not the same. Like a data trust is a bit similar to the publishers that have hijacked our scientific publications and are also receiving all the publications for free. And researchers are not paid, peer reviewers are not paid. But we pay high publishing fees. And I was last year in Guatemala and I was talking to brilliant researchers and they said we cannot publish our research because we cannot pay the publishing fees. So if you put paywalls and gatekeepers before data, you will always create a sort of asymmetry. And I'm more for really creating truly open data sets that are on Hugging Face or on GitHub. You can download for free without any restrictions beside of the license. I've been working on a new license, which is a copyleft license for training data. That would mandate that everybody who uses that data would also need to license the model under the copyleft license. And you would create truly open ecosystems, which is a bit of a viral license. We have troubles because the copyright laws in Europe allow people, even if it would be copyleft license, to still create private models out of it, thanks to the nice copyright laws. But we should not confuse data trust with open data. That's something very different. But these data trusts have their value. I think we need these data trusts because some of the data cannot be published as open data, like genetic data cannot be de-identified. There's many data sets that need protection, but it's part of the puzzle. And as last, if Aleph Alpha now thinks that this is their model, I talked to Jonas 3 years ago and advised him to go open source, or 2.5 years ago, and he said, like, how can I earn money? Now, they received the same amount of funding as Mistral AI last year, about 550 million euros. The valuation of Mistral AI is now at 6 billion. I think the valuation of Mistral from Aleph Alpha is not even 1 billion. They lost the game, and it shows what is important. Important is not the owning data, it's not owning the AI models. Important is having speed, velocity. Is that what you need in order to be successful? And the less barriers you have, like we are now in Berlin. Berlin loves breaking walls. Like the less barriers you have, the more diversity you will have, the more inclusiveness you will have, the less inequalities you will have. And I think we need to work all together on that open vision and see AI just as a new layer on top of the internet, which is a common infrastructure that is not something you monetize or win on, but where you build on in that sense. I think there's an absolute wrong perception out there that we need to start closing all the knowledge and industrializing knowledge. We did that with Big Pharma. We all know how that ended. Like pharmaceutical knowledge became industrialized and it's absolutely closed. We cannot even access the clinical trial study data. I don't think that's a wise thing as humanity to do the same with all the knowledge out there. Because I think we would go back into the medieval ages where if you have a different ID as the authority, which is centralized, you get burned with your head upside down or something. It is what the church did at that time because they were a monopoly of knowledge. We can learn a lot of history, how to not do things. And I think openness and sharing has to become part of the equation for building AI systems in our society.
You mentioned speed, and I think this is something that I think is so important for us. And we left out, I think, one of the topics of the whole panel, which was the decentralized AI part, a little bit. And there I see the opposite of speed, actually, and this is something that really concerns me. Because for part of me in the preparation of the panel was actually saying, yes, this is a topic I've actually been working on for the past 6 years. Yeah. Because in 2018, I was first introduced to federated learning, which is kind of a decentralized AI idea. And when I heard that, and also parts of how to make AI more secure, how to like bring forward other ideas of how to do AI, and in general, this is not only on the side of this type of technology development, but also then going to like into this regulation question. What our biggest problem is that we're always behind in terms of speed and in terms of keeping up with what has been going on in the technology development to actually do regulations, to get the safety and security in, to make it, to get the ethics right, etc. And I think this is the biggest issue that we should tackle first, how we do things. I mean, developers have been doing this the whole time to actually get the cycles short and have whatever it's then called, agile, and it was Scrum at some point, And then when we talk about regulations, when we talk about making the safe, opening things up, we're going so slow that this, for me, has been the most pressing issue of the whole conversation, kind of, especially in terms of regulation and everything. That's just my 2 cents that I wanted to give to that speed.
I would oppose this a bit. We should not regulate things when the Wright brothers invented the first plane, and we would have common regulations that are resembling our modern airspace. I think that would not have been a fit, and we would probably never see the evolution of the aerospace industry. I think innovation needs freedom, and the R&D space needs that sort of freedom. That's a very important factor. Otherwise, we would limit ourselves and we would slow down our innovation. We can talk about ethics the whole time in Europe, but everybody who read the Mario Draghi report that was published a few weeks ago, knows that if we don't change a thing in Europe, we can talk about ethics, but we cannot afford ethics because our economy is not competitive at the moment. We are not as productive. We can talk about all these brilliant values, but if we are not running these systems and have to run the anthropic AIs and open AI systems, we will not define anything in that sense because we have no power, economical power. The second thing on decentralized, this is way more complex than just the federated learning. Federated learning is used a lot in the medical space. So the hospitals are giving access to pharmaceutical companies to leave the data within the hospital so you can learn out of the statistical relations out of the data and leave the data there. But what I want to emphasize is the opportunity here of decentralized usage of models. I just mentioned before, having models running on your phone, and Apple is doing the same thing. We can create a new narrative that goes away from the centralized big tech infrastructure narrative. We can run these models on a phone.
But just one sec. I want to give you also the chance because we have 1 minute left.
Sorry. I don't see the timer here.
So now more on the topic of decentralization. I mean, I see it happening kind of organically. I mean, there's all kinds of layers to it, right? There's federated learning where you kind of distribute training, I guess, amongst in a decentralized fashion. But like what's happening right now is a company releases an AI model, and then many hackers and researchers, they take this and then they retrain it on their data. So I'm seeing this kind of like, it almost feels like a kind of biological evolutionary process happening, just in forums, in communities where people are kind of posting tweaks.
Is it happening really in real life? And you mentioned, Bart, the hospitals. And honestly, I haven't worked with any hospital that has actually used it. This is the thing. This is why I'm saying the speed.
Sorry.
But
Sorry, that's not true. Like the problem with federated learning, it created a problem. It created a problem that now hospitals are selling data access to big pharmas and allow these companies to extract the statistical relationships which lead to a new biomarker invention or a drug target, and they get 3 million for that. Now, if an oncology researcher within that hospital wants to access that data that has been given access to by that pharma company, he needs to ask for consent to that pharma company to get access to that data. So it is being used as a way to circumvent GDPR, to monetize the value out of the data, and it's being used in every single hospital. Federated learning is there. You have even companies called Together AI. They have a federated infrastructure for doing LLMs. Federated is everywhere in terms of learning. So I disagree with that view, Beatrice, sorry.
I know we're stuck, but just saying, I mean, just thinking about like how far we're still behind. That's maybe my last thought on it. I went to the radiologist yesterday and I got a CD with my images. And this is just where I want to say that the speed that we need to get up needs to go everywhere. I'm only in the medical field, but that's just me saying I think speed has been the most important thing that has been said also in the part before, where we just have to keep up, and that's I think my answer. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think we're running out of time. So to wrap it up, I think we all agree that open sourcing is speeding up development. Simply putting it in simple words, and let's keep on doing that. Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you very much, Bart. Thank you very much, Thomas.